everyone, and welcome to the Psych to Practice podcast, your one stop for practical and useful clinical information, masterful insight from experts in the field, and a guide to daily living. I'm your host, Paul Wagner, and I'm actually not being joined by my co-host, Ray, today. But thankfully, we were able to find another Ray to join for today, and I had the pleasure to talk to Dr. Ray DiGiuseppe. For those of you who aren't familiar with Dr. DiGiuseppe's work, he's a professor of psychology and chair of the Institutional Review Board at St. John's University. He has an extensive history in terms of the research of anger, the identification of anger diagnostic disorders, as well as a variety of psychological assessments focusing on identifying anger through the anger disorder scales, as well as the anger regulation and expression scales. Additionally, he works on the development of the theory, practice, and empirical research in support of rational motive behavior therapy, as well as cognitive behavioral therapies, and has previously served as the director of professional education at the Albert Ellis Institute, where he's previously worked with Dr. Ellis himself. And I have to say, after being able to talk to Ray today, the extensive background that he has really building the research on anger, really bringing it into the conversation to help support individuals who struggle with anger, especially dysfunctional anger. So, Ray was really able to go in depth on the research that he's done, as well as the vacuum of research. And, thankfully, it sounds like we're kind of turning a corner here and starting to have, more and more reliable data that we're able to pull from, to support individuals that are currently going through, their education program, as well as clinicians like Ray and I, to really kind of help better serve these individuals. You're only going to get one takeaway from me this time, but, I think the entire episode could be a takeaway. Dr. DiGiuseppe is just absolutely brilliant. One of the moments that really stood out in our conversation was when he was identifying and talking through the impact that anger has in terms of being an adaptive trait, and working to identify at varying levels when anger becomes adaptive as well as maladaptive, and how we as clinicians can then use that recognition in helping to support anger as the approach emotion that it is, and activating to improve communication and resolution, as well as his conversation surrounding, bringing in stages of change. Again, I think I could go on with how just impressive he was in this episode, but please listen for yourself and enjoy this week's Masters in Practice episode, Anger, with Dr. Ray DiGiuseppe. Well, Ray, thank you for coming and join us on the Psych to Practice podcast. Really appreciate you taking the time here on a Thursday evening to sit down and talk about anger.
Thank you. It's really a pleasure to be here. And I always like to talk about anger, but I don't think I'm a very angry guy. People always assume that I must have gotten interested in this because of my own anger. I don't think I'm an angry guy, but people always kind of assume that.
We're here to prove them wrong. And here on the podcast, when we're talking with individuals, we really like to take an opportunity, really hear what got them started in the field. And so kind of what was their story that brought them into psychology or into the mental health field? And Ray, what is that for you? What led you here?
It's probably a pretty typical story for people in our field. I really got involved with this because, when I was a kid in high school, my father died and my mom was left with 3 kids. And I had this middle brother who was really a difficult kid. And I just remember my mom trying to go around getting mental health services for my brother. And, when I talk about that story, I didn't think about it, but I could well up and cry. It was really a major event in my life. My mom couldn't find any place to get treatment for him. He was really kind of difficult. Probably he had some attention deficit disorder, oppositional defiant disorder that was causing now. He was very lost after my dad died. And so I went to graduate school, and I was kind of drawn to working with families with difficult kids. I guess I said, I couldn't help my mom, she wasn't going to listen to me, but I was going to do that. So I guess I've always been on a little bit of a mission to help kids and families of kids with disruptive behavior and probably really started from a parent training model. Like, let's teach these parents things to do. And I always think this is a little funny part of the story. When I got my degree and I set up a private practice, I was really busy, and I would get all these families that none of my peers wanted to deal with. There's a kid who threw a chair, and here's a kid who cursed at his parents, and nobody wanted to handle these disruptive kids. And I was always more than willing. It was a financial payoff, although that wasn't my original motive. And I ended up with a practice that was pretty big because nobody really wanted to do that. So over the years, I kind of got a little disappointed in the parent training strategy that was really effective. And I had a criticism of it. And my criticism was the parent training kind of assumed that the parents just were ignorant. They just needed to learn these new skills. And if they learned these new skills, they were going to be okay. And what I realized with these parents were just really emotionally upset. I always said Freud got it wrong. He says you get crazy from your parents. I think you get crazy from your children. Nothing in the world gets you as upset as your children. And so these parents were desperate. They were angry. They were angry at their kids. They were angry at the school. And I really started to deal with the emotions of the parent. And then I started paying attention to the kids, and I realized that we describe oppositional defiant disorder and, intermittent explosive disorder. All the diagnoses are kind of affectless. Like, there's no emotion in them. And that these kids really had strong emotions. Maybe it was a really disturbed emotion. Maybe it really was a not very frequent emotion, and it was anger. But nobody was really kind of dealing with the anger. Maybe we deal with their anxiety. Maybe we would assume that they had depression, and nobody was really paying attention to that. So I spent a lot of time working with kids and a lot of time sort of thinking about their emotions and the parents' emotions. It got me interested in anger as sort of a bigger research topic, and working with angry adults occurred when I was in the Albert Ellis Institute. I always worked with Al Ellis at his institute. And we were doing a lot of work with a place called the Vera Institute that would send us cases of people with PTSD and, trauma from being domestic violence or victims of crime, et cetera. And we did that for a while. And eventually they said, you're doing a good job. You're helping our clients with have this problem who are victims. Would you take any of the perpetrators? And nobody wanted to take the perpetrator. Just like my early experience with the kids that nobody else wanted to treat. And at the time, I was in a supervision group. I had Chip DeFrady from Central Connecticut State and Chris Eckhart, who's now out of Purdue. Both of them went on to, Chris Eckhart went on to work with domestic violence, and Chip has worked with lots of people in the criminal justice system. And we're going to work with these people that nobody else wanted to work with and who were angry and aggressive. And I kind of thought that my experience with kids sort of was a natural. It was easy to do. And I remember the thing that got me interested in a research career. Chris Eckhart says to me one day, the desk really is on my case to give them diagnoses for this. And I can't find a diagnosis that fits. I said, oh, let's think about that. And he says to me, if you beat your wife once in a while, you meet the criteria for intermittent explosive disorder. But if you do it regularly, not intermittent, that's a problem. And we went through the DSM thinking that, there really wasn't a place for diagnosing people with anger problems. Intermittent explosive disorder had no affect in it. It was just impulsive behavior. If you were really angry, it didn't fit. So I sort of got interested in researching this issue because I realized that we really didn't know a lot about anger, and it wasn't there. And so Chip Tafrady and I sort of started together, and we said, well, we wanted to write this book on understanding anger problems. And, back in the 1960s, Tim Beck had this book on depression that was really like what summarized the scientific knowledge that we had on depression. And Chip and I said, we want to use that as a model. Like, what's everything that we know about anger, just like Tim wrote about everything we know about depression. And every time we would go to do a chapter, we realized, we really don't know much about that. Like, we wanted to do a review, like what research, what is the research on clinical procedures works, and there wasn't. So we stopped and we did a meta-analysis. Like, what are the best strategies to and instruments to assess anger? And there aren't really very good ones. They're not so great, So we designed one, and so every time we wanted to do a chapter of the book, we ended up realizing that we didn't know a whole lot, and we kind of stopped and ended up doing a research project, and eventually came out with the book in 2007. Probably we should do a revision of that because there's a lot going on, but I think that we just realized how much we didn't know.
And how fascinating! Like, I mean, your beginning of your career really starting off with serving, this underserved population that individuals didn't want to work with, then moving on to the perpetrators that individuals didn't want to work with, and then trying to give support. And there's not research because no one's wanted to work with these individuals beforehand.
There's not that much research. Right? I mean, like Roy Navaco from California Irvine was kind of a role model because he had done the one really good scale in the area. And, the Patterson group that did the parent training for disruptive kids, that was really very good for younger kids. And I remember I went to a conference. I was actually presenting at this conference, and I was on this panel with one of these big researchers in parent training. And he made the comment like, we've tended to drop the parents from the study who didn't follow through the parent training. Holy shit, that's like all of my clients. They were like those parents are so emotionally upset that's exactly what it would be. And eventually we developed this thing called the parent anger scale, which everyone thought would like be kind of silly, like parents aren't going to admit they're angry at their kids. Well, yes, they do. It's a pretty good psychometric scale. I did that with Tammy Del Vecchio here at St. John's, where I teach, and Oana David over in Romania. So we had a good international thing on it. But parents really do get angry. And so I guess one of the things that I got sidetracked on is to do assessments, because I really got interested in assessment research, because I realized that a lot of the things that we want to measure to do good research on, we didn't have good measures of.
Yeah.
So when Chip and I we developed a scale called the anger disorder scale. The most popular anger scale, of course, was the Staxi, Charlie Spielberger, who was a great man, and we used to spend a lot of time talking with him at APA conventions. But that's a test about normal anger, normally distributed, really didn't touch the dysfunctional nature of it. And so we tried to look at like what does dysfunctional anger look like? And then there's a couple of interesting things that we found that were really surprising to us. First was we would take the anger scales that existed and try to take a subscale or an item and classify it. And we would do this in a systematic way. And we realized, every scale has different content. Some people have anger out, which is physical. Some people have anger out, which is physical aggression towards people, and some towards physically aggressive towards objects. And some people include anger out, which is verbal aggression. And some people have anger in, and some don't. And so there was this real unevenness. If you were reviewing the anger literature, you would find differences because people use different measures, and the different measures had different content. And so that was really, I think, one of the major things that we found.
I mean, I just can't help but like really at every turn having to start from ground zero and, using what's been done beforehand, but needing to also break it down and coalesce it into something that's more consistent and structured that can be, it's improving that reliability and improving that validity aspect of it so that, okay, when we're measuring something, we actually know what we're measuring and it's consistent across the board.
That's really where's the problem. I think we had better measures of aggression, but not the emotion. It's like the emotion of anger was absent. And it's not in DSM. There are no anger disorders in DSM. And Chip and I, really advocated for that. And I remember a couple people in the American Psychiatric Association told us we were really nutty. That's just never going to happen because anger is really not a disturbance. Anger is a symptom of other problems. I think that there were a couple of scientific issues that we ran across. The first one was this idea that anger is not a primary emotion. It's a secondary emotion. And whenever I do a lecture or something, I always say, someone's going to have a debate with me at the coffee break because they're going to say, well, behind anger is really anxiety. Behind anger, there's really guilt. Behind anger, there's really shame. Anger is always a secondary emotion. And I remember kind of really, we were writing the Understanding Anger Disorders book, and I had these, this was before everything was very electronic. So I had these, print copies of articles, and I had two crates. One of them was articles written by psychologists who studied the psychology of emotions, and the other was clinical stuff written by clinicians. All the clinicians said anger is not not primary emotion, it's secondary. And all the psychology of emotions sort of research theory people and the basic processes of emotions saw anger as a primary emotion. So right there, we had this tremendous divide between what clinicians thought and what scientific psychology thought. And I think that still exists. I just responded to somebody about a week ago on Facebook that says, oh, behind anger, there's always all these other things. I really had to disagree. I said, well, maybe you're right, but I strongly disagree. So I think that was a really big issue. And we traced it back. The true seminal figures in abnormal psychology in the 20th century, you could say, were Sigmund Freud, and big influence on everything. And the other was Emil Kraepelin, who wrote the first textbook of psychiatry. And within about a year of each other, they both wrote that anger was part of mania. Mania was part of a depressive disorder. So therefore, anger really is a part of depression. And they both write it down. They were separated geographically. The things were too close together for them to have read each other and copied it. They probably weren't. Yeah. But Kraepelin and Freud both had this idea. And, I think that there are some relationships between depression and anger. But I don't think that, one is the other. And I think that if you treat the depression, the anger doesn't go away. And you treat the anger, the depression doesn't go away. And so we did, Chip and I did this major review of what the literature says between anger and aggression. And the literature was really very bad. People would use a state measure of one emotion and a trait measure of another emotion and all sorts of things. So I think that was one of the major issues that we found, that just the way people considered it. The other thing is, I was always trained by Al Ellis, who really loved the Stoic philosophers. There's always a famous quote by Epictetus, people are not disturbed by things but the views they set of them. And so, of course, when I was interested in anger, the first person I had to read was Seneca, the Roman Stoic philosopher, who's got a really great book on anger. And, it's like, boy, all the debates that we're having now go back to Seneca. He really said some really great things about anger. And there's some debates which I think are still going on, but the Stoic philosophers are the people who probably wrote the most about anger. And still today, there's a movement called modern Stoicism to try to make Stoic philosophy more relevant to everyday life. And lots of people in that movement are into psychotherapy. They're really still the best people to read on emotional control of your anger. And they start with Seneca, who really was it. And Seneca really argued that anger is almost always dysfunctional. It doesn't really work. It gets us in trouble. And other people say, well, anger is an emotion. It's evolved. It must have had some benefit to our species or it wouldn't have evolved. So there must be some adaptive anger. So that's a debate that I think that goes on today. Is there adaptive anger? And as I was getting ready for this talk, the Association for Behavioral and Cognitive Therapies convention is coming up, and I wanted to present the paper. We have been trying to do some research on whether there's adaptive anger. So we've created this adaptive anger scale to see whether Seneca right or the evolutionary theorists right. And, I did some data analysis the other day, and we found that the items that we had on adaptive anger sort of factor analyzed twice. There's two factors. One was a lot of people say my anger helped me grow because it tells me what I value, tells me what's important to me. And so people kind of think that their anger helps them identify their true values and the things that are important to them. And the other is like anger may help you solve problems. And when we took the second one factor score, that anger helps me solve problems, we found that it was, the more anger you had, it was almost a perfect inverted U-shaped curve. Some anger helps you get to the middle point and then it really drops off. So anger can be adaptive, but once you reach a certain degree of intensity, it really isn't. And I think that's a pretty interesting finding because up until now, we don't even have measures of adaptive anger. We found like 2 or 3 other studies. There was some good dissertation that was done. Of course, the person didn't publish it. And then there's another researcher who sort of put it in a discussion of a paper. Said, these are some things that might be adaptive anger, but we may have some interesting idea. The anger may work for you and anger may help you know yourself. So anger does get a bad rap.
And, how fascinating, like the idea and, in terms of practice, I'm thinking of the different clients that I work with and, when they are, I'm trying to think of like when there is the presentation of anger, when they are, they're getting heated, they become more engaged. But when it's taken too far, that's when we're having to kind of cool it off. And it's because I hear how like it gets into that unproductive point. And I'm curious when they're saying that, or in the data, after it reaches that certain threshold, what are the different ways that the anger starts to become unproductive or almost maybe no longer an adaptive anger at that point?
I think there's a couple interesting issues about this. Let's go back to the ancient Greeks. If you go back, what I realized was that in reading about modern anger and modern anger measures, nobody considered revenge. And if you go back and you read the Iliad and all those old stuff, their revenge is the key motive. There's a whole series of plays that were done in the Middle Ages around the time they were called revenge tragedies. Like there are all these things. And Hamlet is considered the key piece of literature in that genre. We psychologists didn't study revenge, and for people in the literature department, anger and revenge they almost go together. There's a famous philosopher of emotions, Nussbaum, And she says, it's really not anger without revenge. And when I read Nussbaum after rereading the Iliad, I said, where are we psychologists? You want to learn about anger, go to the classics department. Because we miss this entire issue. And I think that people do want revenge, and now they're not really focused on solving a problem. They're focused on hurting another person. And then that creates a cycle of things that go around. Like I hurt you, you hurt me, then I have to hurt you more than you. And it distracts you from any resolution. So this issue of revenge, our anger disorder scale was really one of the first, maybe the first anger scale to include a subscale on revenge. How did we miss that? I mean, Homer would be so ashamed of us, for not including it. So I think that is one of the areas where it's dysfunctional. Second, the other area that it's dysfunctional is, this is another problem that we discovered accidentally. People think of anger as an impulsive emotion. Even the way it's portrayed in DSM as intermittent explosive disorder is an impulsive disorder. And so we created our anger scale. And what we found was, let's put it this way. We did a series of studies to find out how people experienced anger before we created the scale. And I remember when I sort of got this idea, I had given this questionnaire, an interview to this, 14-year-old adolescent girl. And one of the questions we asked is, when you get angry, how long does it last? Right?
Yeah.
Right? And so she says, well, 3 or 4 days. Well, if you have an emotion that lasts for 3 or 4 days, this isn't an impulse problem. This is a rumination problem. And rumination was always considered to be an aspect of depression. And anger was supposed to be, react real quickly, right? And what we found was that rumination was really strongly endorsed by people that have anger problems. And that made so much sense to me afterwards, because, you have people like, how long can you hold a grudge? We have a joke like, how do you know Italian Alzheimer's? You forget everything but the grudge. You can hold it on for a very long time. And I've always collected data on this. The client I have with the longest grudge was 40 years. Wow. Yeah. So people can hold a grudge a very long time. That's the rumination problem. And then what we found was that rumination and impulsivity were kind of related. So like you ruminate, I want to get you, how do you do that to me? And after you're thinking about that for 3 or 4 days, then you want to break out and punch the person. So we really started to focus anger treatments on some things that weren't usually included. One of them was revenge, and the other one was rumination. Dennis Sulkadulski around the same time created the anger rumination scale at Yale. So we had some confirmation of that idea. So it's not just an impulse. It's an impulse, like you impulsively strike out at people after you've been thinking for days about how you want to punch them out, and how they've wronged you. And that was totally missing, I think, in the anger literature. And just think of anybody that that's got, like sort of marital relationship problems. Like, how long can they hold a grudge against your spouse for not putting the dishes in the dishwasher the right way? So.
Absolutely. Seemingly endless. And how interesting that the literature beforehand really only captured this snapshot of impulsivity, and we magnified this, and we, identified, the impulse control management skills surrounding this, but really then not helping to support the underlying factors that led it to it.
That led up to it. Many years, from about the mid 1970s up until after 2000, the most referenced treatment for anger was Ray DiGiuseppe's self-instructional training approach, which was designed for treating the impulsivity. And I guess if somebody strikes out and they hit somebody, it's really, you want to control that impulsivity, but you got to do something to calm them down so they're not ruminating, or else you're going to build up that, intensity to want to do it again. So I think that there were some things that we came across. The other thing that we came across is what we noticed is that anger does often lead to aggression, but it doesn't always lead to aggression. And this is a problem that we really haven't resolved yet. Like, how many times do you get angry before you then go do something aggressive? So I have 10 non-aggressive anger episodes before I have an aggressive one. And what we tend to do is identify people's anger by the dramatic nature of their aggression. So if I throw something, then it scares everybody. But we kind of expanded from our interviews, asking people what they did with their anger. This sort of came from also some work by Ray DiGiuseppe, who was one of the best anger researcher ever. Like, he really had done a lot of great research. And Jerry found that people had more reaction to anger than they did to any other emotion. If you go back into emotions theory, they say emotions evolve to trigger behaviors that can be adopted. And, if you're anxious, you avoid. If you're depressed, you sulk. But anger has the most different behaviors. And when you ask people, they engage in a whole lot of other aggressive behaviors that are beyond cursing, yelling, screaming, hitting, throwing, banging tables. There's passive aggression. People don't really talk about passive aggression very much. It's, but, that you can really hurt somebody with passive aggression.
Absolutely. I think of all my teenage clients that, that becomes a major talking point of, everything that someone didn't do that was so passive aggressive that, carried this semblance of, everything that's their anger, that's why they're doing this. And, so certainly it can play a role and have an impact for others.
The other one that we found was what some other people have identified around the same time, which was this kind of social aggression. Like, I'm going to have a party and invite everyone but you. And I'm going to ask people to kind of ignore you. And one of the things that angry people do is they engage in conversations to encourage their friends and allies to boycott the people that they're angry about, sort of develop so there's kind of a social aggression, which can be very hurtful to the aggression victim. But we don't really ask people how often they do that. So that was another thing. And another kind of aggression that we looked at was secret aggression. Again, anger and aggression, people always look at the dramatic things. I yell and scream, I bang on the desk and everything. But, maybe I break into your house and put a virus in your network and you never know it, what happened. And so there's an idea of covert aggression, which is secretive, and you don't ever know who hurt you. So we kind of expanded the number of aggressive behaviors that people could do in the tradition of Ray DiGiuseppe, that we really wanted to look at a wider variety of things that would get people to be upset. So I think that was kind of a good thing, that look at a better sense of the different revenge strategies that people have.
And certainly as you're sharing, especially that covert anger expression, I can't help but think about the onset of social media and the anonymity that can come along with that, which then, maybe we then don't have to work as hard to suppress or to try to, challenge that anger if it has an outlet that we feel that little to no repercussions for, but that can be an expression.
And I think the people who do that covert aggression, they very much want to and very much enjoy seeing the other person hurt. I think one of the things we still need to research better is how to treat revenge. Because you could say revenge may be a motive of your anger. You mentioned in talking that you work with some kids, and you've probably seen this kid, everybody's seen this kid who is angry at somebody. They tell you that they're going to get revenge. They're going to do something that they're going to get caught. And you say, oh, you're going to get in big trouble if you do that. And the kid says, I don't care. You've seen that? I've seen that kid. I don't care. I'm going to do something to hurt that other person I'm angry at. Yes, I'm probably going to get caught, and I don't care. And I think that those kinds of cases always appear strange, almost psychotic. You're going to do something, and what we really missed was the idea that the revenge is the reward on its own. So revenge is very powerful. There was a group in Switzerland that did these, and crushing games where people, they play like Prisoner's Dilemma game, and somebody hurts you. And just before and then they did this in a functional MRI unit so that they were taking pictures of the brain. And just before the participants would do something to shock or hurt their opponent, the area of the brain lights up, So I always say the big reinforcers in life are sex, drugs, rock and roll, and revenge. It really feels good to people. And I don't think our therapies ever acknowledge that, you're going to do this, but you really think it feels good. And is it going to be as good as you think it is? Is it going to be as helpful as you think it is? We don't really talk about that, but it really is a very powerful, positive reinforcer.
And I'm curious, as you're kind of putting it up there with sex, drugs, and rock and roll, how each of those has this level of satisfaction within the moment, but then how long that sense of satisfaction carries on. And I think traditionally, if I'm thinking of revenge, it's not as satisfying, if we track it over time. However, there are some individuals that I've worked with or talked with that, even in terms of the resentment, the expression of anger still has the level of satisfaction. There's a couple individuals who I've worked with who have come out of prison, and we've talked about this, and it's just felt good. It felt like I got mine.
That's where we've gone wrong, because we haven't acknowledged that really feels great to you. That is like as good as poking an orgasm. That's really. And now the issue is that brief degree of satisfaction really worth it? And maybe we have those kinds of conversations about, as you just said, the enduring nature of the reward. What's the cost of that over time? And I think that we can have those conversations, and they're really important, but we've not focused on revenge as part of our traditional anger management treatment package. So I think that's one of the great difficulties that has been missing, that we would add. We would always kind of look for revenge.
And jumping back just a few minutes, you brought up the social component, and once, talking about the classics and the Iliad, and, what lengths were gone through to raise, this army for revenge, in such a social way, and how we can bring others into like almost our anger can spark almost anger, like almost a group anger in a sense of, we feel an injustice or we feel something, but then it's the activation that anger can have to bring others together as well.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think we want to get revenge on other people, but the revenge focus has gotten us into a new area of cognition. So, since I've trained in REBT and cognitive behavior therapy, I've always been interested in the cognitions that generate anger, Stoic philosophy and all that. And I've always been concerned that I think many anger management treatment manuals, they take the cognitive distortions that were created for depression and anxiety, they take the irrational beliefs for depression, and they then apply them to anger. I think that's why we don't get very successful outcomes. And what we've noticed is this belief or this kind of strategy that is really talked about more in social psychology. It's, I kind of refer to it as the honor code, right? Or sometimes the code of honor. The code of honor is sort of written up, probably the book that describes it best is a guy named Elijah Anderson, who wrote about it in Street Gangs, but he sort of writes about it in African American street gangs, which, the common. And so the belief is, if you disrespect me, I'll have to fight you, not because I need to beat you up, but I might enjoy the revenge, but because other people are going to see that you disrespected me. And that sends a message that I'm vulnerable and I have to protect my reputation in the group. And so I have to fight you. And so there's a big literature of this in the social psychology literature, Elijah Anderson's literature. And I have a major criticism of that literature because it makes it sound like it's the poor inner city youths that do it most, or that a lot of the literature in social psychology says it's done by the Scots, Irish people who moved from the lowlands of Scotland into Ireland and Northern Ireland and then in the United States. And they're all poor, and they're the people who do this code of honor. So we did some research in social psychology. We looked at it. We took it all in ways people had measured this code of honor, and we developed this code of honor scale. We just submitted it out for publication, and we were able to develop a really neat 15-item scale that was measuring the idea that I need to fight you and get revenge without any disrespect to protect me, my reputation from other people. A couple of things that we found is I tried to collect a large sample because people kind of identified this attitude with the poor, the inner city black kid, and I tried to collect a lot of data in downtown Manhattan. And I have to tell you that the honor code gets more endorsement as you raise your income. And after you go over 150 grand, you really endorse it very highly. And I sort of have this story about this guy who was a salesman, and he sold these computer products, and some other salesperson in his company was trying to take credit for his sale to get the commission. And he was the most aggressive son of a bitch I've ever dealt with, because nobody can afford with his commissions. And so I think that this code of honor does exist. I think it's been played as being something that poor people do, but we found that not to be the case. And we're doing a study right now where we think this may be the cognition that cognitive behavior therapy needs to challenge the most. That it it has more power to predict dysfunctional anger than any other of the beliefs like overgeneralization and frustration tolerance. So that's one of the things that we've been working on, is like we can identify like 9 different cognitions and beliefs that people think are related to dysfunctional anger. And they're not all always targeted in treatments, but which ones seem to have the biggest bang for their buck or the most related? And so what we found is there was an attitude which Jerry Deckenbacher used to call inflammatory labeling, kind of related to what Al Ellis used to call, other downing. Like you believe that the person you're angry at is really this totally awful human being. But of course, you don't call them an awful human being. You call them an expletive, deleted, something or other. So there's almost always profanity in the discussion of the worthlessness of that person you're angry at. That's really one of it. And again, other downing is not focused in most CBT anger management books, but it's really up there. The second one that comes across is attributions for hostile intent. Like you did that to try to get even with me. The dodge, and people have done that with kids, and that really holds up. It's a very strong, irrational belief that's related to that. The jury's kind of out on self-condemnation. Lots of psychotherapists believe that you're angry when you have self-condemnation. And, there's a couple studies that show it and other people that don't. And we think that it's not that you think you're a worthless human being, but you're upset that other people don't think you're as worthwhile as you think you are.
Yeah.
I don't really think I'm great stuff. And you always think I'm average. How dare you think of me as average? Right. And so, but that's tough. But then there's the honor code, and the honor code really seems to show a really strong effect. So we've developed this anger code scale, which we think therapists can use. We've developed another way of measuring the anger code in a strategy where we compare it to other kinds of cognitions. And we're finding that in that study, we're still collecting data on that, but that the honor code really is important. You mentioned earlier the idea of nations. And I found a book by a political scientist who identifies the honor code as being something that people have written about in wars all the way back for, like the Hittites, and the Egyptians. The Egyptians had to go kick the butts of those Hittites so that the Nubians wouldn't invade them. And the honor code thing seems to have this long history of not just conflicts within individual people, but conflicts between nations. And I think that that's kind of an interesting finding. So we're trying to be a little bit more scientific and specific about the cognitions that challenge, because it may not be the same cognitions you challenge with depression. And the reason for that is, there's this issue about anger. If you ask people to do a mood induction and you try to get them to feel guilty and anxious and depressed and happy, you get really differences in which side of the brain is active when they express emotion. The negative emotions like anxiety, guilt, they're all on the right side of the brain. Joy and happiness is on the left side. So people used to think it was negative and positive, but it ends up not to be that way. It's really, escape avoidance behaviors versus approach behaviors. And anger is on the same side of the brain as joy. It is the only approach gradient negative emotion. All other negative emotions, you want to avoid the stimulus that triggers it. Except when you're angry, you want to get in that person's face and tell them off. So it has a different anatomical placement, and it has a different function than other negative emotions, which is why I believe behind anger, there's not always anxiety, right? There may be some comorbidity. It really is physically different in the brain. And it serves this very different approach function. So I think that's why we want to study it somewhat separately. But maybe I should have said that in the beginning. And it's one of the reasons to do this, because angry people really do not want to give things up. So I have one other important clinical thing. So if you're a clinician and you have people with anger problems, have strongly influenced by the stages of change people, Carlo Di Clemente and Jim Prochaska. Now, the reason I'm influenced by them is because of my mother, who told me to go meet Carlo Di Clemente because our families came from the same small city in Italy to America at the same time. So,
oh, wow.
So my mother said, you better go at that Carlo because he's related to you and he's a psychologist too. So I started to think about the stages of change things. And it clearly occurred to me that angry people are pre-contemplative. They don't want to change. Just about angry people who come to them, they're always like ambivalent. Like, my boss sent me, my romantic partner said, you better get help or I'm leaving you. That there's all of these different reasons why people come, but they're always ambivalent. There's something about the anger that's reinforcing because of the revenge. There's something about it that is an approach that they want to do it. And what we have found and what we recommend is that the first step of all treatment with angry people is to review the stage of change and why change is good for them. What's the cost of remaining the same? What's the advantage of change? And I would even go so far as to say we review that with each new problem they bring up. You know, this is your 10th session. You have a new problem. I got angry at somebody on the subway today. Well, what's the benefit of you to being angry at the person on the subway? What's the benefit of what's about cost you if you ruminate on the subway all the way home? And that stages of change issue becomes really important because it provides the motivation for change, which I think angry people don't have when they usually come. Or if they do, it's very weak.
You know, and that's fascinating. And there's actually a certain individual I can think of whom I would say actually we struggled to find a diagnosis there for him. And but anger was that primary reason. And there because both boss and wife were saying, hey, we need you to make this change. And we had explored a few different approaches, but when we started talking about the stages of change, that was something he was able to gravitate towards a little bit more so. And it just clicked in a different way where, you know, talking about, you know, some of the cognitive processing and reframing. Yeah, sure. Like, and it was just the ambivalence. And yeah, no,
so the theoretical model that works best to start to treat anger comes from what's called the social problem solving approach. This is an approach that Goldfried and Dizzarella created up at Stony Brook in Long Island, New York, but that a whole group at Philadelphia at Highland Medical, used to be Highland Medical School, now it's part of Drexel University, Spivak and Shore. And now that research is really led by the Nasus, you know, Arthur's Nasu. And they look at, you know, can you think of an alternative intervention to do? And can you think of the consequences of your behavior? And if you go back 20, 30 years ago, Alan Kasdan used this part of this model to treat most aggressive oppositional kids. And the skill that, you know, the Nasus was like consequential thinking. What's going to happen if I do this? Because they're focused on, this is going to be fun if I do this. I'm going to enjoy beating you. You know, I don't really want to hurt you and it's going to be fun, rather than what's going to happen in the long run. So I think that while, you know, the cognitive behavior therapy, cognitive restructuring, and I certainly want to be loyal to Albert Ellis and be influenced by Tim Beck, the social problem solving people in Philadelphia really have the first intervention, because that's going to get you to see that it's not helpful for you. And that's going to get you to see that there are alternative ways for you to work and things to do. And we would always do that to increase motivation and increase alternative thinking before we do any cognitive restructuring. So,
certainly, I'm going to be having some takeaways and you know, going and delving into some of the research here a little bit, you know, after our conversation. But actually, Ray, there's something you had mentioned earlier. I wanted to circle back around to it, and it was the standard distribution bell curve of adaptiveness for anger. And I'm curious about the front half, like when we're not having enough intensity and it's not then adaptive or it doesn't play a role. And for those individuals that maybe it becomes either more suppressed, or maybe their overall experience of anger just isn't as, you know, they don't have it, you know, as significant. Like what's the impact there?
There's an old literature in this that we discovered when we started to do this. And that really came from all the Gestalt psychology and some psychodynamic people who argued that you could have too little anger, you know, and that as a result, you were a doormat and you were afraid of conflict, or you thought of yourself as doing it. And I think that problem does happen. And so that the intervention is to have people not to be afraid to speak their mind, not be afraid to ask for what they want, and to give them assertiveness training.
That's exactly where my thought went. Like the spectrum between passive and aggressive, and pulling on the assertive.
I think that the assertiveness issue is really important because I think people that have too much anger and have too little anger, both are very unassertive. So the people that you've just mentioned, the people with too little anger and they get walked on, they don't know how to say, please don't do that, or no, you can't, or I don't want you to do that to me anymore. They have difficulty speaking out. But the people who have too much anger seem to be equally unassertive. They'll curse you out, but they won't say, gee, Paul, I wish you wouldn't do that again.
Yeah.
So that if you want to get them to reduce their anger and aggression, it's almost like you have to train them in a new way. So you would say the relationship of anger to communication is unassertiveness at either end of the continuum. For the very low anger and for the very high anger. So that whether you're treating the inadequate amount of anger or the excessive amount of anger, assertiveness training really needs to be a core part of your intervention. Otherwise, the person can't resolve any interpersonal conflict. They remain a doormat or they remain too aggressive.
And, going back along with that social model of treatment that you're talking about, working to then identify what are the consequences that we're wanting to work towards rather than the satisfying experience of the act of aggression or anger itself.
Right. So we are sort of always pushing assertiveness training. And, if you look at, one of the treatments that I think is really good for anger is Marsha Linehan's dialectical behavior therapy. She borderlines, they have a lot of anger and they need to, and she has sort of incorporated and expanded one of the original assertiveness training exercises. Now, Marv Goldfried refers to assertiveness training as the forgotten empirically supported treatment. But it's not taught much. And whenever I'm going to a place to talk, do a workshop, or I always ask, how many people here learned assertiveness training in their graduate courses in behavior therapy? People under 50 never raised their hand.
I would not raise my hand.
Right?
Yeah.
They didn't learn it. It's sort of like the forgotten intervention. And it really seems crucial here. And people have it's sort of dropped out of the textbooks. And it's almost like we've gone too cognitive, or we're so interested in the cognitive part that we forget this basic communication skill where people are deficit. So we would always add that.
Going back to the model that you were sharing, anger as an adaptive trait for us, I hear how it then becomes this continuum for having our needs met through assertiveness. And, without anger, we then aren't, or maybe not activating or approaching.
Yeah, maybe it's some emotion within the anger family. It may not be real anger, but it may be assertiveness or desire is maybe not up there. But maybe if you think of that there's a family of emotions that may be considered in the anger family. Some of them may be enraged, some of them may be bitter, some of them may be assertive, some of them may be, reconciling, some of them may be negotiating. The more ways you can conceptualize how you want to be, maybe the better off you are, right?
Yeah.
Because otherwise you may be stuck with being a doormat or stuck with being an enraged person. And I think that's sort of one of the issues. And I think that there's two other treatment issues that I think are really important for angry people when you have angry clients. And the first is, this is why I think DBT does really well with angry people. And that is anger doesn't get any empathy. There have been studies on this. If you have a new client that comes in and they're angry, only nuts like me work with them, man. You have somebody at work who's really angry. You don't have support. They don't get support. And when the angry person sort of does have a legitimate right that somebody committed a transgression upon them, they usually nuke the other person. They go too far in their retaliation. And I've seen this happen 1,000 times, is that the angry person will say, I did this behavior. Yeah, I did that. But that's because this person did something to me first. And everybody in the environment will say, but you shouldn't have, you retaliated too strong, and they never get a validation that somebody made a transgression against them. And so they are committed to convincing you and everybody else that somebody screwed them over. And if you just say, yeah, that really was bad that they treated you that way, you can feel like get a lot of the defensiveness going. So I think that Marsha does that really well. I think Al Ellis always did that, because, if someone would come into REBT and say, so-and-so doesn't respect me, I'm not going to challenge that belief. I'm going to say, yeah, you're probably right. They don't respect you. And that really is sad. And now how are we going to deal with the fact that they don't respect you? You're validating. And so I think in the REBT mode and in the DBT mode, there's a validation which helps the angry person so they don't have to convince you that there was a transgression against them. And that's really important. The second issue related to this relationship issue, I've never written about this, I've only talked about it, is I think that, the Therapeutic Alliance literature, my good friend Chris Moran, who writes about the Therapeutic Alliance, well, Steve Banks, all that literature is really on anxious and depressed people. And angry people, aggressive people, I think that there's a different element that needs to be added to the Therapeutic Alliance. And that has to do with our attitudes. And if you are afraid of them, you're dead. You've lost your effectiveness as a therapist. And, angry people like to get revenge, but you like to use their anger to control others. And if you're intimidated and they know that, you're just in this bad pathological interpersonal relationship. So I think it's really important not to be intimidated. I run this anger group at the Albert Ellis Institute every Wednesday night. So I ran it last night. And every year or 6 months, I take in a new trainee to co-lead the group with me. And I think that the thing that they learn first and that's most helpful is not to be intimidated. Because if they're intimidated, they can't say anything. If they're intimidated, clients run all over them. If they can say, yeah, you're right. You can validate that, yes, somebody that treat you badly. Now you're responsible for how you're going to react to that transgression. And you without being afraid, you got a fighting chance. All right. So the Therapeutic Alliance, I think, may be different.
And, going back to modeling that assertiveness in a sense and demonstrating how to identify and work towards goals rather than, the passiveness that can occur with the intimidation. Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. So, if the client is using their anger to intimidate others and you get into that dynamic with them, you're just repeating the pathology relationships that they've already had. And you really want to do something different. So,
absolutely. Well, Ray, I appreciate so much I just feel fascinated and I find myself wanting to go and, look into some of the literature and starting to explore
angry people.
Yeah. And working to become a better clinician, to support those individuals and also, and I guess by proxy, supporting those individuals that first sparked you and getting into the field to begin with of, when individuals are struggling, when there's anger begets more, anger in other individuals, how we can really help to support that and, navigating and making it more assertive rather than aggressive. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. That's what we have to model for them.
Yeah. We'll start pulling back here. And, one part is that we are the Psych to Practice podcast. And, Ray, would love to hear what keeps you motivated or what keeps you psyched to practice?
I think I like when I work with angry people and they have positive relations. I get a lot of people referred to me through HR and their bosses. When they have a good relationship at work, they can know they're not going to get fired for their anger. They feel really good. I feel really good. When somebody can take the bus home and not get into a fight, it's like such a good feeling. And Janet Wolff used to say, anger is not an aphrodisiac, and anger really is destructive to intimate romantic relationships and to parent-child relationships. And you can really see that when people control their anger and learn to be assertive, the quality of their relationships blossoms a lot. And that's really reinforcing because they have a closeness to people that they haven't had before. So that's one of the things I think keeps me going in it.
And certainly, your work, it creates an opportunity for clinicians to do that. And so, thank you for that.
Okay, thank you.
One other thing we like to ask about is, if you could recommend one piece of content, so be that, book, movie, TV show, podcast, music, for those in the profession, what would it be?
I was thinking about that. I always liked the movie Anger Management, although it was kind of silly. Everybody used to say it. And there's this one scene in the movie Anger Management where the Jack Nicholson character, who's the psychologist, is supposed to treat the life. He has them on driving over the Queensboro Bridge connecting Manhattan and Queens. And he's going to sing I Feel Pretty from West Side Story. And that you want to get people who are angry to do something totally silly and different from what they expect. And if you can get them to do that, they got a fighting chance to not try to intimidate other people. If they can, kind of laugh at themselves and learn to have a new response, I think that's really key. And that's the one that stays in my mind the most.
Absolutely appreciate it. I'm going to have to go back and I'll rewatch the entire movie, but keep an eye out for that scene again. And the last question we like to ask is, if you could provide our listeners with 3 gems or takeaways that you've learned over your career, what would they be?
I think the first one is be concerned about the emotion. A lot of times people are worried about the behavior and the aggression, and they don't ever ask about how the person feels. And they're not just their behavior, they have feelings. Yes, they're going to want to change their behavior, but I think we have, in this field, we have too little focus on emotion. Whereas I think the rest of psychotherapy, we're always interested in how people feeling, but when they're angry and aggressive, we don't want to know how they're feeling. So we don't pay attention to their emotion. I think second is the importance to validate the transgression that the person has experienced. Even though they may have inflicted more harm on others that was inflicted on them, even though they may retaliate greater than what was done to them, every angry person feels a victim. And if you don't sort of validate that, they're just not paying attention to you. They're just going to turn you off or try to convince you. And I guess third, I was saying this sort of beginning of therapy, don't be intimidated. They'll respect you if you are not intimidated. They're not crazy. They've just got this bad habit of intimidating other people. And if you can't be intimidated, you're okay. You have a chance. So those are, I think, the things that would be most important for the therapeutic process with angry clients.
Certainly that unconditional positive regard. And, really,
Rogers wasn't crazy, like he could do it. And if you look at the number of psychotherapies you build on, unconditional positive regard is an important thing. May not be curative all on its own, but without it, we're probably not going to go very far.
And, it's always fascinating. And I think in every conversation we have on the podcast, there's a tether to this, and it's the idea of the relationship that heals. And, even in here, we need to create that relationship that says, I respect you, I hear you, I validate you. So let's get together and actually do some good work.
Yeah, right?
Yeah.
And so you're not shocked. And sometimes, the angry, aggressive people, they're used to shocking people, and they expect to shock you, and they're really going to try to shock you. I have this collection of stories of like revenge stories. Like in my group, people like try to say like, who's done the most offensive revenge act? They're really funny, and they're really dramatic, and they're really effective. And they think I'm going to think really awful of them when they tell me this. But okay, I can understand how you want to do that. Yeah, and they don't have to do it. I understand that you want to do it. And so there's an old psychodynamic article on the therapeutic relationship with aggressive kids that says you want to validate and reflect the desire, but not the behavior. I understand that you want to do that. Right? Yeah, I can understand. You're not the only one who may want to do that. So I think that we want to do that.
Absolutely. Well, and Ray, thank you so much for taking the time to sit down and talk about anger. And I can say personally, I've taken away so much. And my co-host, Dr. Ray Krishner, isn't able to join us, but I'm sure he's going to thoroughly enjoy listening through. And I just really appreciate having you on the podcast. And with that, is there any area, or I'm going to retake this. If our listeners are interested in learning more about what's going on, whether that's new research or, just things that you really think that they would value or they would benefit from listening to, where should our listeners look to hear what's going on for you?
I guess maybe I'm going to have to put this podcast on my own website, because I have done a really bad job of promoting the kind of things that I'm doing. But I'm going to create a web page, or go to the Albert Ellis Institute. I have a thing there on anger, and I'll post things there. We have a number of new measures. We have the Code of Honor scale that I spoke about, and the anger cognition scale. We've created this thing called the romantic partner anger scale, which is really, really kind of interesting, to be able to, we can share that with people, because you get the most angry at the people you love. We've also created another new instrument, in psychology, psychotherapy research is really big on ROMs, routine outcome monitoring scales. And I realized that most of the ROMs aren't related to anger and aggression. The items are just too diverse. And I've given them to clients who are angry. I don't show any improvement because there's not too many items. So we've created the AMOQ. The OQ is like a famous outcomes questionnaire by Mike Lambert. We have the anger management outcomes questionnaire. It's about 25 items. We have data on 1,000 people, have pretty good norms on it. And it asks about how angry you've been in the last 2 months. So people want a copy of the AMOQ. I'm more than willing to share it. Okay.
Well, certainly. Thank you. And I appreciate that. Hoping our audience takes an opportunity to go and, just putting out good information and improving the understanding, but also the support that we can give individuals struggling with some dysfunctional anger.
Thank you.
And with that, if you're interested in hearing more and staying up to date with what's going on for the Psych to Practice podcast, you can visit our website at www.psychtopractice.com or follow us on all major social media by searching Psych to Practice. We'll be back in 2 weeks, but until then, be well and stay psyched. The information contained in this podcast and on the Psych to Practice website is intended for informational and educational purposes only. Nothing in this podcast or on the website is intended to be a substitute for professional, psychological, psychiatric, educational, or medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Please note that no professional patient relationship is formed here, and similarly, no supervisory or consultative relationship is formed between the host, guests, and listeners of this podcast. If you need the qualified advice of a mental health professional or practitioner, please contact services in your area. Similarly, if you need supervision on clinical matters, please locate a supervisor with experience to fit your professional needs.